Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Women Leaders, the podcast that explains global events through discussions with women experts. And welcome to ELN, the European Leadership Network, the home of this podcast. I'm Ilana Beit-El. I'm a Senior Associate Fellow at ELN, and I'm your host for this conversation with women who are leading and shaping the world in many ways and fields. So after a very short spring break, 1 week, and after 40 days of war, and now 2 days of a very fragile ceasefire in Iran and vaguely the Gulf states and not at all currently in Lebanon, the world is still waiting to understand what actually happened other than massive destruction in Iran, the Gulf and the Middle East, and what is going to come ahead of us. Lina Khatib is a visiting fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Middle East Initiative and an associate fellow at Chatham House's Middle East and North Africa program, where she previously served as director. Hi, Lina. It's really, really great to see you.
Thank you for having me on this very interesting podcast. Thank you.
Lina, as ever, please tell us about yourself.
I have been very busy analyzing the geopolitics of the Middle East. For some time, I have an active interest in Iran's regional role and the changing power dynamics in the Middle East. I have been mainly in the think tank world over the last decade and a half after a career in traditional academia. In the think tank world, I have led Middle East programs or centers at institutions in the US, in the Middle East, and in Europe, basically. The UK physically is in Europe. So as you mentioned, one of my roles was director of the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House. I previously did a similar role at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And having worked on the region for 15 years, interests have tended to be constant in many ways, but also evolve in other ways. And right now, I am primarily interested in the big shift in the regional order in the Middle East. I think we are living in historic times, and my research currently is focused on that. And I just want to flag that I've just published a paper at Harvard called The Degradation of Iran's Proxy Model, and that paper captures one of the big changes that I am detecting in the Middle East right now.
We will come to that very interesting paper because I'm fascinated with it. And we will come also to the historic shifts because I think I could not agree with you more on this idea of there's a historic shift going on, but everybody is focusing on the details around as opposed to the substance of it. But just very specifically on the ceasefire. So we're recording this on Thursday, the 9th of April, 2 days after it was announced at the very last minute that there was a ceasefire. What do you think of the ceasefire and what do you think it's going to lead to, if anything?
I remain on the fence regarding the ceasefire. I think it's healthy not to be overly optimistic about the ceasefire, and that's simply because although the demands remain far from clear, but what is known, at least publicly, is that the Iranian position and the American position are quite far from one another. The nuclear enrichment issue is at the heart of this because Iran will not want to give up on nuclear enrichment, whereas this is something that the US regards as non-negotiable. But there is also the model of Iran's influence in the Middle East, which is its proxies like Hezbollah and other militias. The US wants Iran not to exert influence in that way, but Iran has invested so much in these proxies, and although now this model is not effective anymore for Iran, I personally see it as a case of ideological positioning by Iran politically. So here I'm talking about the political ideology, not the religious ideology of the Islamic Republic, having been built on the idea of exporting the revolution, as they call it, in Tehran. I find it very difficult to imagine that the regime there is going to just say, okay, we're just going to give up on this pillar of our existence. So I think finding common ground between what the US wants and what Iran wants is going to be quite difficult. We have been here before, standoffs between the US and Iran with negotiations going on and then violence flaring up again. This has also happened in the context of other conflicts in the past. Think that just because we see the framework of ceasefire and negotiations, then this automatically means that we are seeing an opening for peace. I think the situation is a lot more complex.
So let's talk about that complexity for a moment, because I'm fascinated by your idea of the political as opposed to the religious. Can you separate them off in Iran to that extent? I thought the two were intertwined, and I speak here as somebody asking questions as opposed to anybody pretending to know. I thought the two were intertwined to the extent that the revolution was religious.
Well, the revolution was Islamic, of course, but it used religion as a political tool. Religion was used to rally the masses and generate a sense of legitimacy for the new powers that took over in Iran in 1979. But politics is a huge driver here behind the behavior. It's not religion. If it was religion, I think, we might have seen other things. For example, this elevation of the idea of martyrdom, you see the Islamic Republic trying its best to survive, not die. So I don't think anyone should really look at the religious aspect as being the determining factor in political behavior. It is useful for rallying the masses, as I said, for cultivating legitimacy. Politics, the political ideology is a whole other story. And here, if we want to look at that in terms of what, that ideology is for Iran, as I mentioned earlier, exporting the revolution is one part of it, which is that Iran seeks to become a regional leader in the Middle East politically, and it is spreading its political ideology as one way of doing that, so that there is a religious reference in Tehran, but at the same time a political reference for various groups that Iran supports militarily, economically, and politically. And here we're talking about the Houthis in Yemen, latecomers to the scene, but very early on, Hezbollah in Lebanon, after that, Hamas in Palestine, and of course, the militias in Iraq. And when we think about these groups, most of them are Muslim Shia, but as people know, Hamas is Muslim Sunni, and the Houthis follow a different category of Shia Islam from that followed in Iran. So that should give also another indicator that it's not really religion. It's a political ideology based on defying the West, especially the US and Israel, trying to present Iran as an alternative model, and as I said, seeking to have regional leadership in the Middle East through activating this idea of revolution and loyalty to Tehran. So in a way, it is in Tehran's interest, when it comes to the current ruling regime, for there to always be a state of crisis in the region. Because when there is crisis, then they can work on this revolution, to use it to rally the masses, to kind of say, we are under threat, and therefore we need to be armed, therefore we need to protect ourselves. The narrative of victimization is very strong also in this political ideology. So you can see it's a very dark political ideology, really. And unfortunately, for decades, Iran managed to spread it across the region. But what we're witnessing now is the beginning of a reversal in this wave.
Absolutely fascinating. Can I just say that the way you're describing Iran is very similar to Russia under Putin in many ways. The ideology is to spread power.
Yeah.
Be powerful. It doesn't matter as long as it's Russian power and he's at the top of it. That's what seems to be his ideology. And if I'm understanding, once you take away the religion, that's really what the regime in Iran is saying.
Yeah, I mean, that's why for me, religion misleads us when we as observers try to understand the political and geopolitical dynamics going on. And this is why, for me, these now thankfully obsolete frameworks of Sunnis versus Shia, explaining the region in terms of sectarian tension have always frustrated me, because I felt they're too simplistic and they don't really describe the actual exercise of power in the region. And as you said, this is not exclusive to the Middle East. You mentioned Russia. Another thing that they have in common is the military ideology that is based on just accepting the idea of loss of human life. And this is not just in enemy ranks, also in their own ranks. So the idea is everything is sacrificable for the sake of regime survival.
And was this part of Ayatollah Khomeini's original idea, or was this what came after the Iran-Iraq war?
No, this was the original idea. Exporting the revolution happened very early on. With this package of very dark aspects that I mentioned, this was something propagated as early as 1979 when Khomeini came to power. He came to power trying to say, let's move away from monarchy and have this permanent revolutionary spirit going. Of course, it was emphasized during the Iran-Iraq war because Iran has always characterized that war as, between quotation marks, the imposed war. So it emphasized the idea of victimhood. And in a way, they are using the same framework today with the war with Israel and the US by saying this was another war imposed on us. So this idea that everything they're doing is for self-preservation and defense means that they are trying to present themselves as victims as opposed to the reality, which is they are a destabilizing force in the Middle East that has been for, almost half a century responsible for a lot of devastation across this region.
Absolutely, that I couldn't agree with you more. And the hatred of America was because it supported the Shah, because of the 1953 revolution, or just we need an enemy?
I think they would invent an enemy if there wasn't one, because this idea of victimhood means there has to be a victimizer. The US has been a very convenient one. One big factor, yes, is 1953. Basically, idea that the US wants to come and take Iran's resources is a big one. And we have to remember that, yes, in history, the US did orchestrate regime change more than once, I would say, in Iran and the region as a whole. And so for the Iranians, the issue of wanting to nationalize oil and with the US intervening and getting rid of what at the time was, an acceptable leader to the Iranian population and replacing him with a Shah who turned out to be corrupt and oppressive is something that Khomeini later utilized to bring himself to take over in Iran, even though he ended up acting not just like the Shah in terms of oppression and dictatorship, but I would say far worse in many ways. And so, the irony is that the regime claimed to be fighting things that it ended up nurturing and growing itself. And this is why the Iranians now, in terms of ordinary people, are fed up with this, because a lot of people very early on overlooked these aspects that I talked about that frankly should have been cause for alarm. But people dismissed them because they really hated the Shah. They hated living under that dictatorship, under a monarchy that was famous for having its intelligence services everywhere, monitoring people and torturing them and imprisoning them. And they genuinely thought that perhaps this new leader is a cleric, so he might be ethical and just, and ignored, the rally to permanent revolution and all those negative factors. And this is human nature, because humans by nature are optimistic and they want to see something different, thinking they, would eventually head to a better future. But now those people want to see an end of this regime, and that's why thousands and thousands of people protested in Iran against the regime very clearly at the beginning of 2026. And this is why the regime cracked down on them with violence, killing tens of thousands, because it could see that when people see the light and express rejection, this means the regime is facing an existential threat. And nothing scares the regime more than its own people resisting it. So in many ways, yes, the US has always been a convenient external enemy to use, but I would say the bigger threat is domestic.
Fascinating. We're going to come back to the domestic, but What is Israel in all of this? Jews have always had a strong relationship. And in fact, there was a strong relationship between Israel and Iran after the fall of the Shah. What was the sudden switch? Why is Israel the little Satan?
Well, again, it became convenient. So 1979 obviously happened after a period in which the Middle East saw Arab countries engage in several wars with Israel, of course, the famous ones being 48, 67, and 73. And so by the time Khomeini came, the Palestinians in particular and their allies, mainly in Lebanon, were facing defeat in terms of the with Israel. None of their wars managed to get rid of Israel. That's what they thought they could do in 48 and in 67 and even in 73. And in the end, Israel was still there. There comes Khomeini thinking, well, this is convenient as a way to spread Iranian influence because exporting the revolution is one of the pillars for power, of power in Iran. And therefore, the Palestinian cause proved to be very convenient. So Iran utilized this cause to rally Arabs to its side, especially, and here the religious element does play a role, especially that Iran is a Shia regime and most of the Arab world is Sunni. So in a way, this alignment regarding the Palestinian cause allowed Iran to still bring people to its side, even though it didn't come from the religious background of the majority in the region. So this is something that Iran used heavily in terms of its propaganda, calling one of the squares in Tehran Palestine Square, and constantly talking about Palestine in political speeches in Iran and claiming that it supported Hezbollah because it's a group that is a resistance group against Israel. And even before the rise of Hezbollah formally, Iran was already engaged with Palestinian factions. Interestingly, a lot of those factions were secular at the time. So there was a relationship between Yasser Arafat, the PLO, and the regime in Tehran very early on because, again, the Palestinians thought, well, here we have someone willing to help us. And again, because they hadn't managed to get rid of Israel, they thought this would be a useful way to get more support. So there was this relationship that was basically being exploited by Iran. And unfortunately, it did work because it allowed Hezbollah to rise in Lebanon. This contributed to the creation of Hamas in Gaza. And Iran continues actually to use the Palestinian cause. But if anyone thinks about it in real terms, it becomes very clear that this is really not based on any concrete action for Palestine. And I think since October 7, 2023, with Hamas's horrific attack on Israel, it became very clear where Iran is in terms of where it's deploying its resources, where its priorities lie. The Palestine issue is being subsumed. One of the interesting shifts in rhetoric actually happening at the moment in Lebanon with Hezbollah is that for the longest time, Hezbollah was using the term resistance to talk about its activities and talk about Israel as the aggressor and calling itself the resistance. Like it became a nickname for Hezbollah. It appropriated the term resistance to refer to itself. I noticed in the current context of the war after Hezbollah's intervention on March 2nd, 2026, it started to go back to the early use of the term jihadism as opposed to resistance to describe its activities against Israel. And in the very early 80s, 82 till, the 85, around that time, 87, I would say, basically before Lebanon started seeing Hezbollah as a political actor. At that time, it was mainly a military actor. Hezbollah was very much using the term jihadism very prominently. It never stopped using it, but as I said, the term resistance became more prominent, deliberately so, because it wanted itself to be seen as legitimate. Now it's going back to the idea of jihadism. And in a way, when you think about that, you think, okay, it's because Hezbollah's action right now against Israel in the current war is to support Iran. It's not in the Lebanese national interest. It's not to say we are a resistant actor for Lebanon against Israel. It's to say we entered the war because the Iranian supreme leader Ali Khamenei was killed by the US and Israel, and we decided to intervene to aid Iran. And so again, here in a way, the Palestinian cause gets sidelined, and it's all about the survival of the Iranian regime. And so, yeah, it's a very revealing war, this one, that we are in regarding the instrumentalization of the Palestinian cause by the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Absolutely. I would just note, and this strengthens your point, that, and I was just double checking, as we are speaking, then the Israeli government has just announced that they're opening direct talks with the Lebanese government on peace and disarming Hezbollah. So that, in a way, underlines what you're saying, that, I think Netanyahu is doing it out of desperation because he's perceived to be a loser. Nonetheless, it underlines this idea that at the end of the day, the war is about Iran and it's not about Lebanon. And finally, the two sides between Lebanon and Israel have come to the conclusion, or are trying to come to the conclusion, that they need to settle this between them, and Hezbollah has no place in it. Does that work?
Well, for Israel, currently there is in Lebanon the best government that Israel could hope for when it comes to the stance on Hezbollah. Until 2025, all the governments in Lebanon and the top leaders had to have Iran's blessing to be able to be in that position. But after the fall of the Assad regime in Syria at the end of 2024, the situation shifted, and Lebanon, for the first time, elected a president and selected a prime minister who were not put there one way or another or approved by Iran. And this has been a significant shift in Lebanon that is hugely positive. And I regret that Israel has not taken full advantage of this development in Lebanon. For example, the intense bombing of Lebanon on April 8th, that was the most violent Israeli military campaign against Lebanon since the invasion of Lebanon of 1982. That undermines the position of the Lebanese government. This really makes the government vulnerable. Israel should do the opposite. Israel should actually recognize that this is the first time that the Lebanese government issued a directive saying that military activities by Hezbollah are now banned. And the government wanted the Iranian ambassador basically to effectively not be able to serve the selected ambassador that Iran sent. These are things that Lebanon never dared do before because of Iranian intimidation. And so here we have very concrete steps taken by the government in addition to calling on Hezbollah to disarm. The problem with Lebanon is that the government and the Lebanese state do not have the capacity to enforce all those things. So the Iranian ambassador refused to leave. Hezbollah refused to disarm. Hezbollah refused to stop its military activities, even though the government again and again, repeated those calls. So I think, instead of acknowledging the limitation faced by the Lebanese authorities in this regard, Israel took the opposite stance, which is to blame Lebanon for being too weak to confront Hezbollah. And let's not forget that Hezbollah's military power remains stronger than that of the Lebanese armed forces. Even though Hezbollah's own capacity has been severely degraded militarily, it is still domestically able of exerting coercion. And so Lebanon cannot do this on its own, cannot stand up to Hezbollah on its own. So now with this new shift in Israel to say, fine, let's have direct negotiations with Lebanon, there is a glimmer of hope, because both of them have an interest in disarming Hezbollah. Hezbollah has shown that its primary interest and only interest is Iran, not Lebanon, and it is engaging in this war against the wishes of the majority of the Lebanese people and definitely against the orders of the Lebanese government. So it is basically a rogue actor, and it is destabilizing Lebanon, not just Israel. So both of them have a shared interest, and this is something that I think the US needs to capitalize on to bring these two countries towards peace and stability. And later on, any rogue actor, whether Hezbollah or any other group, can then be jointly countered through an international mechanism to support security and stability, in those two countries, because Lebanon cannot do it on its own. It does need international guarantees and international backing. So maybe things had to get kind of in a way worse before they got better, but that's unfortunate because it didn't have to be like that. Unfortunately, I think the Israeli government missed out on an opportunity to prevent this loss of life that has been happening, whether in Lebanon or in Israel actually for a while. But better late than never, I would say.
Absolutely. I think that the current Israeli government is so bad that it's not least in its inability to capitalize on military gains strategically or, in a political and policy sense. But maybe being pushed into a corner on this one will at least produce something with Lebanon. Because I think from everything you're saying, I've heard Hezbollah described as a Iranian militia as opposed to a Lebanese militia. And I think we can maybe agree on that.
I mean, it's now shown that it's definitely following Iran's interests and not Lebanon's interests. I mean, in the 80s, it presented itself as a resistance actor, and it was embraced in Lebanon on that basis. It claimed victory in 2000 when Israel withdrew and used that to get political legitimacy at a very high level. Lebanon. But after that, it started using more and more coercion to assert itself in Lebanon and rise to become the country's most powerful political actor. Now, it had used coercion very early on. It's not like it suddenly started being coercive. I mean, in the early 80s, when Hezbollah rose, there was something called the Lebanese National Resistance, which was a secular movement of various groups that were conducting operations, military operations against Israel after it came to occupy Lebanon in 1982. But with Hezbollah's rise, it wasn't in Iran's interest for there to be a rival calling itself a resistance group. It wanted to monopolize resistance. And that's why Hezbollah was coercive towards those other secular actors, and also coercive towards other Shia groups in Lebanon, famously the Amal movement, which was another Shia militia, and it fought Hezbollah bitterly and lost. And Hezbollah therefore asserted itself as the only political voice of the Shia community, and later on started oppressing and murdering any opponents that were, calling for a change in the status quo in Lebanon. And this is why Rafiq Hariri, Lebanon's former prime minister, was assassinated. Various Shia activists had to flee the country. So Hezbollah has always been coercive, but it kind of increased its coercion after it got this legitimacy in Lebanon as a resistance actor that was seen as being auxiliary, but not formally, to the Lebanese army. And so one could say that the engagement of Hezbollah in Lebanese politics was only a pragmatic move on part of the group to be able to consolidate its power in the country, as opposed to what some might characterize as Lebanonization. So it's not like it became more Lebanese in its activities and objectives. No, it was using the Lebanese state and its own involvement in the Lebanese state to consolidate its own power, and in fact contributed to further weakening the Lebanese state and Lebanese state institutions, including the Lebanese army. So now Hezbollah is being revealed for pursuing its core objective, which is extending Iran's influence in the region. So nothing about what Hezbollah is doing now is actually to Lebanon's benefit. Zero. Everything it's doing is about Iran. So whatever it had done for Lebanon in the past, I think has now been erased by its current stance and current actions.
And can it survive without Iranian money, or is it rich enough on its own now?
Hezbollah generates a lot of money from its illicit financial operations all over the world. Personally, I have been doing research on this, and I have a paper published by the Austrian Ministry of Interior's Documentation Center on Political Islam and Extremism. That paper is published on April 15, and it'll be a public paper looking at Hezbollah's financial operations in Europe, showing that these operations are connected to its activities all over the world, mainly in Latin America and Africa, such as engagement in the trade of drugs and blood diamonds and money laundering through luxury goods and cars and even art. And so even if Iran stops giving money to Hezbollah, it still has this lifeline. And that's why it's important not to focus on Hezbollah just in terms of its military degradation and in terms of what it's getting from Iran, but also these big networks where Hezbollah works very closely with the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, as well. And this is why it's important that finally the EU listed the IRGC as a terrorist entity after many years of resisting doing that, because that gives European countries further jurisdictions to be able to trace and block these financial activities. Having said that, Hezbollah depends a lot on money from Iran, and the Iranian presence is not just about finances, it's also about political ideology. And so if the regime in Iran goes, and if Lebanon signs a peace deal of sorts with Israel, then this removes a huge, if not all, the raison d'etre for Hezbollah's existence. Because if Israel is no longer an enemy of Lebanon, then on what basis is Hezbollah resisting? You know, what is it resisting exactly? If there is no big patron outside, my own research on Islamist groups shows that actually without the presence of an external patron, these groups eventually wither. And this applies to Sunni groups and Shia groups. And one thing I wrote in Foreign Policy magazine last year is that Iran is the last remaining state patron of jihadism and Islamism in the world when it comes to the Middle East. And so they have no external patron if Iran goes. This is the last one remaining. So I expect it will be very difficult for Hezbollah to survive as, you know, a group that is both a political entity and a militia without Iran, even if it continues to generate money from its illicit activities around the world one way or another. So the political ideology aspect is very important for its survival.
Absolutely. This is so fascinating. Before we get back to Iran, let's move slowly towards it. Syria. The dismantling of the Assad regime, that must have been crucial to undermining Iran's influence?
Absolutely. I mean, again, I wrote yet another article in Foreign Policy at the time calling it the Middle East 1989. So for me, as someone who has worked on Syria very, very closely since before the uprising of 2011 and very closely since, I saw the fall of Assad as breaking that core element holding Iran's so-called axis of resistance together. Because Syria was the place where Hezbollah trained its troops, the thoroughfare for Hezbollah to receive weapons and resources from Iran, engage in the trade of drugs and other illicit activities to generate funding. And so with that gone, Hezbollah became suffocated. It had an unfriendly regime next door in Syria, which is the administration of the current government in Syria, which hates Iran, and rightly so, and doesn't have diplomatic relations with Iran. And then it has Israel to one side and the Mediterranean Sea on the other side. So the removal of this lifeline was huge for weakening Hezbollah and also for Iran. This idea of a so-called axis of resistance was based on Iran being able to move freely across Iraq, Lebanon, Syria. And with Syria gone, it became impossible, basically, for Iran to operate in that way. And this translated into a very direct political gain for Lebanon, because shortly after, so the Assad regime fell in December 2024. 1 month later, in January 2025, Lebanon elected the first president who wasn't selected or approved by the Syrian regime of al-Assad family. And there it is, Iran's so-called axis of resistance was beginning to crumble. And again, going back to the paper that I wrote for the Harvard Belfer Center, this is a paper about the degradation of Iran's proxy model. So this proxy model was for years Iran's way of exerting influence in the region. And with the fall of Assad, this model started to degrade severely. And it is now being replaced with state-centered models of security as Lebanon and Syria seek to assert the state as the only entity that is allowed to possess weapons. I mean, in Lebanon, we're not there yet because obviously Hezbollah continues to possess arms as we speak. However, this is something that the Lebanese government is actively working towards, and rightly so. And the same applies to Syria. Again, this is something that the Syrian government is heading towards. And both of these things are positive for security, not just for the national security in Lebanon and Syria, but for the security of the region as a whole. And when it comes to Israel, of course, not having rogue actors in possession of weapons is a much better Middle East than existing next to neighbors who have actors that could one day use those weapons against the Israeli people. So where Lebanon and where Syria are heading, I think, is definitely positive. And the fall of the Assad regime marked that big moment, enabling this shift that is currently unfolding.
Let's move one state further. Iraq. Iraq is still a playground for Iran? Yes? No?
Iran is next to Iraq. And Iraq, therefore, matters a lot to Iran. And Iran is not going to easily give up its influence in Iraq. But the thing is, like it did in Lebanon, Iran thought that the best way for it to have influence in Iraq is to cultivate militias that would be loyal to Iran and have these militias have state legitimacy. So it's not exactly the model of Hezbollah, but very similar. And it achieved that with the establishment of the Popular Mobilization Forces. But with time, a lot of these groups started to make their own money, so they were no longer financially dependent on Iran. They started to have their own political ambitions. And unlike in Lebanon, where there's one group, which is Hezbollah, we're talking, more than 100 groups in Iraq. So it's a very different situation in which there's competition amongst these groups as well. So it's not as easy in a way for Iran to just use this model of paramilitary groups to gain influence in Iraq. And what has happened now is that some of these groups remain ideologically loyal to Iran because they see this as a way to maintain their own power domestically. And this is one thing I talk about in my paper, that they have domestic ambitions when it comes to power, when it comes to retaining their weapons. And they feel that having Iran as an external backer is useful to allow them to maintain these privileges. But other groups felt that actually integrating into the state suits them just fine because they don't really mind whether they have their own weapons or not, because they feel that if they are part of the state, then the weapons that they can use will still be theirs, but at the same time be part of the state apparatus. And for them, this is an acceptable formula. So they don't have to use them outside of the state's wishes. So they have become more pragmatic in terms of their integration within the Iraqi state. Other groups don't care about weapons at all, because for them, this has been a way to get economic privileges in Iraq. So yes, they may have started as militias, but later on use this to make money and also to get political privileges, and they are fine with having money and a bit of political power. So you see there's a divergence in positions amongst those groups. But for the Iraqi state that had for a long time been in a way led by people who were close to Iran or loyal to Iran, this model of having militias that were not always obeying the state became a liability. And so the model of influence that Iran created in Iraq, thinking that this is a guaranteed model of long-term influence, is now proving to be a liability for the Iraqi state. And the Iraqi state, therefore, as of, last year, but even a bit before, been calling for state monopoly over the use of weapons in Iraq. Of course, some of the groups are resisting that. And so you can see that the Iraqi state doesn't want to operate as an Iranian satellite. And at the same time, you have the relationship with the US that matters a lot in Iraq, especially because of business interests. A lot of the groups are enjoying the economic privileges because of Iraq's relationship with the United States. The last thing they want is for Iraq to become a pariah state, because this hurts how much money they can make. And so it is in their interest for there to be a continued relationship between Iraq and the US. And so Iraq had to balance its relationship with the US and its relationship with Iran. But if there is a change in Iran, then I think this would cause a very significant shift in Iraq as well, and perhaps lessen this burden of having to balance these two kind of opposing actors.
Time is not on our side, but the Houthis, you said they're latecomers. This is the last part, really, to a certain extent, of the Shia Crescent or the crescent of resistance. Why were they latecomers, and why are they so important? And where do they stand in all of this?
The Houthis were not created by Iran like Hezbollah was. The Houthis are a Yemeni group that later started this relationship with Iran because Iran courted them for obvious reasons, because Iran is always looking for militias to co-opt to extend its influence. And they thought this would be a useful relationship because they got finances, they got military equipment, and they also got mentoring from Hezbollah. Through Iran. So Iran was useful for them operationally and politically. And this relationship was consolidated, I would say, in the like around 2015 when you had the Saudi-led campaign in Yemen. Around that time, I would say the relationship between the Houthis and Iran became stronger. It had already started, but it wasn't really a relationship of the Houthis being regarded as a component of the so-called axis of resistance. So they have been the latest proxy to join this group of militias that engage with Iran. But the key thing about the Houthis is that their drivers are primarily domestic. Even when they have projected themselves as regional actors, such as when they started attacking Israel after 2023, supposedly in aid of Gaza, and when they started attacking ships in the Red Sea, supposedly under the same banner of so-called resistance, they did this in order to increase their political status inside Yemen more than anything else. Now, at one point, they did think that they could perhaps also become a regional actor and replace Hezbollah, but that faded because they just don't have the capacity to do that, and they have been dealt significant military and financial blows by Israel and the US recently, after their involvement in the 2023 war against Israel. And so the Houthis right now cannot be regarded in the same way as Hezbollah. Hezbollah will fight to the last breath for Tehran. Decisions of war and peace are taken in Tehran on behalf of Hezbollah, whereas with the Houthis, there is still a degree of domestic agency going on for the group. And they are being quite measured. They don't want to lose currently their so-called resistance credentials, but at the same time, they know that if they go all out in aid of Iran, this could mean the demise of the group, and they want to be able to survive in Yemen as a political actor. So the situation with the Houthis, I think, is a bit distinct.
Very. So fascinating. Lina, having done the Crescent, what's the war? Why was there a war? What's the war about?
The key thing is this model of Iran being the sponsor of proxy groups that have caused destabilization all over the Middle East, that have been threatening Israel's security, but also the security of Arab countries in the Gulf and the security of countries in the Levant. Look at the devastation these groups caused Hezbollah and Iran-backed militias in Syria, for example. This status quo needs to end. And this is what the war is about. And I always go back to October 7, 2023, because ultimately Hamas is part of this proxy network. And it is Hamas that attacked Israel on October 7, 2023. And Israel's response has been to go to the source of the problem. So it's not just about Hamas. It's about the status quo of Iran being a rogue actor in the region. Israel recognized that its own security depends on eliminating this threat once and for all. And Israel cannot do it on its own, so it needs the US on board. And as it happened, this coincided with the arrival of President Donald Trump in Washington, who saw eye to eye with the Israeli government regarding the threat posed by the Islamic Republic of Iran to Middle East security. So that's what this war is about. It's a war that aims to completely change the regional balance of power in the Middle East so that there is no more threat posed by Iran, whether to Israel or to the Arab world. Now, because this is a regime that has been in place for almost half a century, removing it is not going to be easy. And because it has these proxies in multiple countries, this automatically means that these proxies need to be tackled as well as part of changing the status quo. So that's why the war has been so complicated, so costly, and not swift. I mean, anyone who thought that this would be a swift campaign, getting rid of the supreme leader in Iran, and then that's it, the regime would just crumble, was fantasizing, because this is a regime that is entrenched, that has multiple pillars that it has planted in different countries to have influence and to survive and to protect itself. And now it is fighting an existential war, so it is activating all available tools, whether economic tools like blocking the Strait of Hormuz or inflicting economic cost on Arab countries in its vicinity, or military tools like using its missiles and drones, or its proxies like activating some of the ultra-loyal militias in Iraq as well as Hezbollah. Iran knows that this is basically the last battle, and it is trying its best to survive. It knows that for the US and Israel, the maximalist goals are real, and Iran is trying its best to survive, thinking that if it survives this, it can then prevail indefinitely. And that's why it has no qualms about sacrificing the Iranian people, sacrificing the Lebanese people, inflicting as much damage as it can, because it feels it is facing an existential threat. But that also means that for the US and Israel, stopping now while the Iranian regime is still in power is counterproductive, because all this means is giving this regime an opportunity to then regenerate and perhaps come back even stronger in the future and become more threatening. And this would also leave the allies of the United States in the Arab world even more vulnerable. And so for me, that's why when people talk about ceasefire agreements or negotiations as an off-ramp, I personally think we should look at the big picture. And the big picture is, just as Iran feels this is an existential war, I would say for the US and Israel, this is a very rare opportunity that they are taking advantage of, because Iran is at its weakest. Its proxies have been largely degraded. It has been dealt significant military blows, and it has lost all its external political allies as well. And so it is isolated in the weakest position. And this means, it's an opportune moment for the US and Israel to shift the balance of power in the Middle East once and for all. So this will take some time, because regional orders cannot be changed overnight. But we are witnessing this historic shift. And I expect that once the war finishes, there will be more peace deals across the Middle East. There will be more pragmatism amongst the rulers of the Middle East. And that hopefully should bring more stability that is much needed to this region.
Well, one can really not add much to such an outstanding summary and such a wonderful declaration of hope, because it's so much needed in the region. Of that, there is no doubt. Thank you so, so much, Lina.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So that's a wrap on this episode of Women Leaders. Keep listening to our conversations and support us with a subscription on your podcast platform. Leave us a 5-star on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And of course, add to the conversation with your comments. In addition, help support our podcast and spread the happy word of this episode to friends, colleagues, enemies, and anyone you think would like it. We're on all media, so reach out on Instagram as @women_leaders_podcast and on ELN Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. All information and links mentioned in the episode can be found in the notes. I'm Ilana Beit El, together with my friend and producer, Florence Ferrando, and we'll be back very soon with another great conversation.